what I'd like to do is take you through some of the components that are needed in order to create the wall framing, and also to go through the process that should be taking place. And I'm trying to do this sped up, so please just pick out the parts that you're currently in need of. I also have a keyboard here at the bottom, which will allow you to see which keystrokes combinations that are taking place when I move something, so that way you can see and apply in your work. So the first thing that I've done is I've come over and I've created a little bit of a library of materials for myself, and each of these was later turned into a component. So the first thing I created will be a 2x4, in this case 1 3/4 inches thick, 3 3/4 inches wide. That's rough. These vary quite a bit depending on species and who's supplying the materials and how much they've dried, actually. So this could actually be closer to 3.5 and probably closer to 1.5 as well. I acknowledge that, but those are the dimensions we're all going to work with. I've also come over and I created a 2x6, 1 3/4, same thickness, but now 5.5 in width. And I've also created a 2x12, 1 3/4 inch by 11.25 inches wide. The lengths of these will vary, but what I've done is I've created myself a 2x10 and a 2x16, a 16 footer and a 10 footer when I created components. So when you get started, it'll look like this, where they are separate elements, just lines that have come together. And if you select the entire thing, if you select the entire object and make sure you get all of them, this far end is not selected, and you right click, you can make these into a component. And into your component window, which I have right here, this space here allows you to decipher what each of these components are. Otherwise, by default, it gives you component 1, component 2. And what I'll write in here is this is my 2x12, and this is a custom cut 2x12. In the case of this item here, this one's extra long. It's a little over 18 feet long, and this is for the large span of the garage door opening. But this, what I want you to take from this is that this is a place where you should be customizing the names of these components. As you can see over here in my component list down below, I can see that I have 2x12s, 2x4x10, 2x4x16, and then a bunch of other modified versions of those components. The number 1 gets applied to them, and I'll talk about that in a little bit here. And then anything else any of the other pieces that I've used were added into this process. So the first thing you want to go through and create, and I'm going to turn this on because I've already created it, is you want to create a bottom plate. Sorry, I couldn't remember what I titled this layer. So this bottom plate is 2x6 elements on the exterior walls that wrap all the way around in the wall space that we've already identified. So you can see how they butt up against each other in each corner, and they go all the way around along the exterior walls. Interior walls are running here, and I got 2x4s for the interior walls because our interior walls are typically narrower, shallower. And one thing that I did not do here is I did not open this one or cut this one open for the doorway that we were about to be dealing with, and I don't know why that happened, actually. I'll have to go back and take a look. Actually, I think I accidentally edited the wrong component. So one of those little things I'll have to go back and clean up. But what we're looking to do is to lay a 2x piece of material, whether it's 2x4 or 2x6 piece of material, around the entire perimeter, excluding the doorways, which I just found out I messed that up a little bit, and I'll have to go back and fix. Once you've done that, you need to lay your studs in place. So I'm going to turn the studs on. There's a lot going on here, so I want to show you what I'm doing and how I go about doing it. And I'm going to start out by dragging a 2x6 in here. And I know this isn't properly placed, but I want to show you the keyboard shortcuts that are necessary. So I'm going to first place my first stud into the corner of this building. We also know that we have a 9-foot ceiling, so you got to alter the length of your 2x10 or 2x6x10 or 2x6x16, so that way it's the proper length. In this case, it's 9 feet. From the ground to the top of this piece is 9 feet. And then I labeled it as a stud. So once I have this in place, and it's the proper length, 2x6 stud is in place. To move these, they all need to be 16 inches on center. So I'm going to use the move tool or the letter M, and I'm going to hit the Option key, which you can see that getting pressed in the lower left. Ooh, it's giving you some weird stuff there. It's just the Option key. And then I'm dragging my piece across, and I'm going to type in 16. So I typed in 16 and hit Enter, and that spaces these two at 16 inches apart. Studs must be no more than 16 inches apart, or you're going to break standard building code, and your walls are going to not be strong enough. So I moved those 16 inches, and now you are eligible, or the option is available to you to hit X, the letter X, and the number of times you wish to duplicate that action. So it's going to duplicate, in my case, I hit X12. It's going to create 12 copies of that move that I just created. And this is helpful when I come over here and take a look at, I'm going to delete this quickly. When I come over here and 16 inches apart, all the way along this wall, I have my studs. When I come to the end of a piece, it's longer than 16 feet or longer than 10 feet, and I have this seam, that's where I place an additional stud. So these two are obviously closer together, and then I start back up with that process again on top of the next bottom plate. And this will carry me all the way to the corner. The ends of each bottom plate should contain a vertical stud. So this is the very end, and there's a vertical. Then I come around the corner, and the start of the next one has another vertical. And the same thing, that same process will continue all the way along this back wall and end over here. If there's a seam in the middle somewhere, there should also be studs seamed up in the middle. All right, just making sure we don't have a weak spot somewhere in this process. Once that is done, and you have all of your verticals placed in, you need to add an additional element. And this way in which we reinforce the corners has multiple purposes. It keeps your walls connected together better. But I added this one additional element, and I really just copied this one and moved it over by hitting the Option key. Just replace it's the same element, it's just in a different position. And what this allows is if we're going to attach drywall or any other sheet material to the inside of our building, we now have a nailer, a space in which to attach the material to this wall and then to this wall. So it helps on the inside, but it also reinforces the structure of this building. So each corner needs that element. So you can see here I have this L shape that I've created and reinforced. So that way I have a nailer on the inside of this wall space. I'll come over to the other side here and show you how this may look a little different on an exterior versus an interior wall. I don't necessarily need to do that on this little turn because I have a nailer on both sides, and this is more than reinforced against each other. But on an interior wall, I have this nail space for attaching sheet materials, and also it reinforces that corner. All right, so that would go the entire way around your structure as well. So that's placing all of your verticals. A few additional verticals that you need to make or make accommodation to is this element that structurally holds up the header, this long piece of material across your building. This is my 2x12 that I said is custom cut. It's a little extra long to span this distance, but we're going to place it directly on top of the bottom plate, and its height must lead us to that 7-foot opening that we were originally after when we planned out this room. This is actually, I'm surprised it says stud right now when I select it because I thought I titled this one trimmer. I might have titled these incorrectly. But this is typically your trimmer, which supports the bottom side of your header and carries the load, the structural pressures above this large doorway opening down into the ground. So that's why it must be underneath and shortened so that way you can structurally hold this together. All right. Same thing happens on this doorway. I don't need a 2x12 though. I can get away with a 2x6 for this header, and it will come up and hold up any of the forces above it. These studs that follow above must be no more than 16 inches apart. These are called Cripples. So I'm sure I have them custom. I'm sure I have some 2x6 Cripples over here somewhere. Yeah, there it is. There's my 2x6 Cripple. And these are two different lengths because the opening has a different width for each of these elements. These are wider than this one. Therefore, this piece is longer than this one. So you got to make some different length Cripples for the size of the gap it needs to span to get us to that 9-foot top of the wall, which is what our goal was. Once this is completed, once these pieces are placed, and the cripples can probably be done after this next step, you need to add a double top plate. So what is a double top plate? Well, it starts out pretty much identical to your bottom plate. So in this case, my bottom portion of the double top plate is identical to my sill plate. So there's my seam, and up top here you can see there's the seam as well. The key difference in between the two is ensuring that our seams don't align with one another. So what we do in the corners is that we got to change the length of these two pieces to ensure that this one runs over top of this seam, and that there is no seam over here where the new seam will be created. All right, so hopefully you can follow along with that. You got to change the length of the second levels pieces, that way the seams don't align. The same thing happens in the middle of our wall. I actually have a 16-footer over here and a 10-footer on this side. Actually, I slightly modified that, and I just flipped the orientation of these two so that this seam does not align. If I did everything identical and just copied and pasted them on top of each other, the seam would still align, and that's a problem. It's a point of weakness now that the walls could want to pull apart. Same thing in all the rest of the corners as well. So here's one that's not offset by quite as much, but it needs to be varied so that way our seams don't overlap. And also, you can't extend anything beyond 16 feet or those standard dimensions that we started with, 16 footers or 10 footers. So just got to be careful when you're doing that. You don't end up with a 16.5-foot long element, which we typically can't purchase. We don't easily purchase. So just got to be a little bit mindful of that as well. And as I mentioned earlier, you may then come back and put your cripples in. Sometimes it's easier to place a cripple once these elements, the top plate is in. All right, so that's really what we're trying to get through with the framing of our walls. And I will soon add our joists, the system across the top that can carry our structural load for the second story and or our roofs.